Scott Fitzwilliams passed along this story of his hunt with Dennis Neal in the Teton wilderness many years ago, a story he calls Trophy of a Lifetime, Squared. It was late in the season, the last day of their hunt. At 4 o'clock that morning, well before dawn, Dennis and Scott sipped on their coffee and agreed that this day would be a meat hunt. The freezers were empty, and after several days of looking for good bulls, they needed to shift gears and take any elk they saw. They saddled the horses before light. Dennis noted how this day was perfect for hunting. Some fresh snow, mild temperatures, and no wind. Scott agreed, and they headed up the trail. After a couple hours of riding, they stopped and glassed a basin a mile or two above them. At the same time, they both spotted the unmistakable golden color of elk, a band of 10 or 12 animals. They quickly mounted their horses to try to get into a better position to view the herd. They watched the elk for 2 to 3 hours, the entire time trying to figure out how they could get within range of the herd without killing themselves. They kept up their hopes by telling themselves that they could head down the ridge later in the day. Sadly, that was not the case. That herd kept going, and they finally had to give up. It was about 1 in the afternoon when they decided to make a large circle and head back down to Pacific Creek Trail. They plodded along for an hour or so when they came upon some fresh elk tracks. It looked like 4 or 5 elk, one of which they knew was a bull because it would always go around hanging branches while the other elk ducked underneath. After an hour of tracking, Dennis and Scott realized they were heading in the same direction the elk were, so they stayed on them, hoping they would catch the herd before it broke out into the meadow down below. Based on the tracks and scat, the elk were not far in front of the hunters. Their excitement began to increase as they got closer to the ridge above the large meadow. But just as they could see the meadow below, 2 shots broke the stillness. They kicked their ponies to get to a vantage spot where they could glass to see if they could see the elk. Well, they saw a hunter in the meadow below. Unfortunately, he was already field dressing a nice 6-point bull that they had chased right to him as he sat near the edge of Pacific Creek. Dennis and Scott didn't say much to each other, as they both knew that this meant the end of their day and maybe the end of the elk season for them. They decided to ride down and have a chat with the hunter who shot the elk they were chasing. Sure enough, he said the group of elk just came trotting down the ridge, and he was able to make an easy shot. But he did say one more thing that caught their attention. While he was dressing the elk, he turned around, and not 25 yards from him stood 2 huge bull elk just staring at him. Having already filled his tag, he was resigned to simply watch them walk down the trail. Almost simultaneously, Dennis and Scott asked, "Which way did they go?" To their surprise, he said they headed down the main trail toward the trailhead. Now, it's important to note that this was a busy trail. This area was the last unit in Wyoming that hunters could take bulls on a general tag, so all the hunters around who had not filled their tags early in the season were up in the Teton wilderness trying to find a bull. Given the circumstances, Dennis and Scott didn't get their hopes too high. They were in a relatively open meadow interspersed with willow clumps, not the place a person would normally find trophy elk. But almost immediately, they picked up the track. The tracks were huge and the scat was fresh. After about 15 minutes of trailing the elk, Scott wondered out loud to Dennis if in fact they were not following moose tracks. Moose were common in the area and often would not shy away from hunters at that time of year. It was getting late in the day, but they were headed toward the truck, so they continued on the tracks, occasionally standing high in the saddle to get a better vantage around the willow clumps. After a mile or so, the boys got a bit complacent, resigned to the fact that their season was about to come to an unfruitful end. The horses plodded on when suddenly Scott jerked to a halt, eyes wide and mouth open. Standing in front of them, not 100 yards away, were 2 massive bull elk. For a nanosecond, Scott stared, not really sure if he was seeing what he was seeing, but then, without a word to Dennis, he reached over his saddle, grabbed his rifle out of the scabbard. He bailed off his horse and ran around a clump of willows to get a clear shot. Dennis was behind Scott, so he had no clue as to what the hell was going on or what Scott had seen. He just knew it was time to get off his horse and follow Scott. they left the horses standing where they were, reins lying on the ground. They sprinted for about 30 yards, and Scott shouldered his rifle. Both elk were facing away from them, so he didn't shoot right away. Scott said to himself, "Shoot the first one that turns broadside." The elk showed no sign they were aware of the hunters. Finally, the lead bull turned and quartered toward Scott. Instantly, Scott touched the trigger. Bam! The bull hunched and stumbled. A lethal hit. The bull collapsed after the second shot. To their surprise, the second bull started running at an angle towards the hunters. Everything seemed like slow motion at that point. It was a wide-open 40-yard shot, and Scott knew exactly how this was going to end. Dennis didn't miss very often, and he sure as hell wasn't going to miss that shot. Dennis pulled the trigger. Bam! But he did miss, and Scott was dumbfounded. The second shot, however, was perfectly placed, and the bull fell face first in a puff of fresh snow. Silence. For half a minute they just sat there in the snow, mesmerized by the sight of those two huge bulls lying dead in the meadow. Scott finally broke the silence. "Holy shit, can you just believe what we did?" High fives and hugs followed. After admiring the trophies and filling out their tags, Dennis looked around, squinting, and screwed up his face and asked, "Where are the horses?" "Oh, crap," Scott said. "After all the shooting and hoopla, they must have hightailed it down the trail, the wrong way." Scott admitted if they took off for the truck, he wouldn't have cared. The joy of those two trophy bulls outweighed any setbacks at that point. He ran back down the trail where they'd dismounted, and sure enough, the horses stood there exactly where they'd left them. It had been a long day and a long season for those ponies. They weren't going anywhere. Now, field dressing one large bull is hard enough work, but they had two. They each got down to the business of gutting and quartering the elk. Exhaustion set in, but the thrill of the hunt made it easier to carry on. While they were field dressing the elk, several hunters rode by admiring their trophies. A big smile came across the face of the hunter who'd seen those two monsters as he was dressing his smaller bull. "Glad you guys got 'em," he said. One set of hunters that came by were the subject of conversations for years to come. One guy asked them where they had shot these elk. Well, baffled by the question, they responded, "Right here." He refused to believe them and pressed for answers. Dennis and Scott stuck to their story, of course, and this guy finally headed down the trail muttering nonsense about their story. He had insisted that Dennis and Scott had shot these 900-pound animals somewhere else and dragged them to this particular spot for field dressing. And Dennis and Scott just shook their heads. It takes all kinds. It was dark by the time they got the hindquarters and heads on the horses. They buried the rest of the meat in the snow to retrieve it the next day. They even went so far as to cover the animals with as much clothing as they could spare, hoping to keep the bears off the kills overnight. Back at Scott's house, they sipped on several glasses of whiskey, retelling the story to each other 100 times over. They were like two little kids. It was the hunt of a lifetime. Dennis and Scott had many successful hunts together before and since, but this one was one to remember for all time. Scott said that the years have accumulated and some memories have faded, but the memory of that hunt remains burned in the hard drive of his brain. He is honored to have experienced this one incredible day of hunting with Dennis, his best hunting partner ever.